So thank you for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for tuning in what for many people is, of course, their lunch hour. And I know that by this point in proceedings, screen fatigue, online fatigue is a very real phenomenon. So thank you for coming along nonetheless. So I was asked by the Development Office to talk about current research, and after sort of laughing in a hollow fashion at the thought of doing research in recent months, I rallied. So I will talk about current research, and I've been working for a very long time now, an embarrassingly long time really, on creating an edition of the letters of William Sancroft, who, as we've heard, ended up as Archbishop of Canterbury, 79th Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed over the winter of 1677 to 78, had a decade at the top of the church and the great misfortune to be Archbishop of Canterbury at the time of the Glorious Revolution, which was a very difficult situation for someone at the head of the church to navigate, and I'll come back to that shortly. I hope to finish this edition next year, but I have been saying that for the last 6 or 7 years, so it's more a triumph of hope over expectation really, but I will do my best. Now, initially working on this edition of the letters was meant to be a means to an end. I thought I wanted to do a big biography of Sancroft because there isn't one, and that working on the letters, creating a scholarly edition of his own letters, would be a good stepping stone on the road towards that. But over time, this project's taken on a life of its own. It's a sort of Frankenstein's monster, which is now roaming around my office, causing me all kinds of problems. So it's become a major exercise for me in its own right. And today I want to try and explain a little bit about why. This project's been taking me far too long, and I'd like to blame Sancroft himself for that, in the sense of having appalling handwriting and being very difficult to read. But as this letter shows, actually he's got rather good handwriting, so I can't blame him on that score. This is a letter from relatively early in his life. This is from the mid-1630s, so he's a late teenager, early 20s at this point. Quite clear, as you can see. The handwriting changes somewhat into a mature style in later life. So this is when he's Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1680s, slightly more distinctive, but still extremely readable. So I can't really blame him across the board. I can blame him for the fact that a lot of the letters only survive in very messy drafts, lots of crossings out, lots of clauses moved around, lots of scholarly and editorial conundrums to wrestle with. And I can also blame him for being formidably learned, which is extremely inconvenient, particularly for a modern, non-classically educated academic trying to create such an edition. Sancroft was a superb Latinist, a very good Grecian, good with Hebrew, variety of modern languages, and he was the Greek tutor at his Cambridge College, Emmanuel, which I'll come back to in a minute. So the letters are larded with a good deal of classical content, which is also slowing me down somewhat. But the main reason why it's taking me so long is the scale of the enterprise. About 350 letters by Sancroft survive, quite a large number for an early modern figure. And it's unusual also in terms of the range of his life that's covered by these 350 letters. So most early moderns who aren't born into very famous landed families only really tend to survive in the archive after they've reached some high post in life. So William Laud, Charles I's Archbishop, one of the key figures in the run-up to the Civil Wars, very few letters from Laud survive before he becomes a bishop. We don't know that much directly from his own hand about his earlier life. Sancroft, very unusually, has a good spread of letters all the way across his life, back to being a teenage undergraduate in Cambridge, across the 1640s and 50s, then on into the Restoration and his time as Archbishop. And that's a problem in the sense that there are so many letters to edit, but it's also a great and interesting opportunity. It's rare to be able to see someone that one knows in retrospect is going to make it big in their career in the early modern period and watch them develop from their teenage years onwards. So that's an interesting dimension of the project for me. And overall, there'll be about 225,000 words of transcribed letters and about another 125 of footnotes and introductions. It's going to be quite a meaty book by the end of the day. So hopefully the project will have a degree of importance, both because of this unusual spread of letters across his life and because of the high office that he ultimately attains as Archbishop of Canterbury. But as a project working on the letters themselves, I think there's also great interest in his skills as a letter writer. His epistolary skills and rhetoric and writing are really very striking and increasingly interesting to me, which I didn't anticipate when I started the project itself. So, for instance, let me just try and move slide again. He writes very, we might say in the modern period, very flattering, very enticing letters to his patrons when he's a younger man looking to climb up the greasy pole, initially in Cambridge and then in the broader Church of England. Fluent, ingratiating, rhetorically very skillful, extremely well educated man. And I put up on the screen part of a letter that he writes to Richard Holdsworth, who was the master of his Cambridge College, Emmanuel, until Holdsworth was deprived by the Puritan regime for his royalism in the 1640s. And this is in reply to a letter that Holdsworth wrote to him, telling him that his letters were wonderful, tremendous to read, and were only to be read upon holy days, so on special days. Sancroft immediately falls on this ball that's been bowled to him and delivers it back again with interest in this particular way. Fit indeed they are to be read upon holy days. I mean such as our new reformers have left us, who have taken some red letters here and there out of the calendar, but filled the story of the whole year with blood. This is during the civil wars, of course, where after ages shall read their fate with horror and once again set up a new holy day in memory of their deliverance from them. Sir, I am heartily sorry that you should put yourself upon the trouble of answering my follies and make my boldness so authentic by an act of your love. But I am all shame when I see you so forget yourself as to descend to an apology and can reply to that with nothing but blushing. Afterward, you begin to chide, but with such incomparable sweetness and mildness, as if you meant to whip me with a nosegay of flowers, or at least to bind up your rods in silk. I think it will be my wisest course to offend again, that I may again be so lovingly reprehended. Now, of course, this is grotesquely over the top for a modern audience. We would see levels of sycophancy of a quite nauseating level here. But the basic sentiments are far from out of place in the early modern period. This kind of series of compliments wrapped up in as elaborate and eye-catching a literary form as possible would be quite expected. But I would argue that the degree of skill and the fluency in being ingratiating and catching the eyes of his patrons and those he admires is particularly striking. And I think actually his skills as a letter writer become part of his career, part of his rise within the church, particularly after the Restoration. He's very good at catching the eye of important people and then maintaining their interest. So in the remainder of today, I want to briefly answer my opening question of who was William Sancroft in three quick ways. So firstly, a whistle-stop tour of his life and career, so what he actually did, who he was in terms of what he did. then very, very quickly turned to how people understood who he was, so how he's represented visually and in writing. And finally, and most importantly for my general overall editing project at the moment, think about how he understood himself. Who did William Sancroft think he himself was? How did he self-fashion his identity, as some scholars would like to put it, looking particularly at some of the letters. Okay, so he's born into a comfortably off but not armigerous family in deepest High Suffolk, Ufford Hall, just outside the village of Fressingfield in the northeast of the county. And this is an almost parodically boring picture of that location, which, as you can tell, was taken by my own fair hand a few Easters ago. And really, if it has value, it's predominantly to show the kind of environment in which he grew up. These big open fields and skies of High Suffolk, as it was known at the time. Very, very rural. It still feels remarkably remote today, actually, traveling out there. In the 17th century, really very difficult to get to, particularly in the winter time. Lots of commentary in the letters about bad roads and impassable, being cut off and so on in this particular part of East Anglia. So he has a typical education for someone of his kind of status and background. He's sent off to grammar school in Bury St Edmunds, then one of the best schools in the country, and from there on to Cambridge. He ends up at Emmanuel College, which might seem, for any of you who know about early modern Cambridge, to be a slightly surprising choice. It had been founded as a Puritan seminary in the reign of Elizabeth to create Puritan clergy who are going to go out and convert the English to a particular vision, particular version of Protestantism. And bearing in mind that Sancroft will grow into quite a repressive, intolerant, anti-Puritan Archbishop of Canterbury, it might be surprising that he goes to Emmanuel. But one of his uncles is the master at the time, a man of the same name. So William Sancroft the elder is master of Emmanuel, entirely natural in this period to follow those kind of family connections to a particular college. So that's why he ends up at Emma, and he goes on to do very well academically. He's a second son, so he's always going to have to make his way in the world. He's not going to inherit much in the world of primogeniture. Unfortunately for him, he is academically extremely able and attracts some of the patrons that I've already alluded to. Takes his various degrees, and in 1642 becomes fellow of his college, clearly a great ambition of his up to that point. A bit of a bummer of a year to become a fellow of a college, though. Of course, this is the year that the English civil wars kick off. And over the next few years, Cambridge, being deep within the parliamentarian heartland, comes to be increasingly affected by Puritan governing regimes looking to tender various forms of oath and tests of allegiance. And Sancroft, quite typically for his personality across his whole life, reacts to that by being as evasive as possible. He keeps his head down, he hides, he sits tight. Periodically, he leaves Cambridge on key days when he knows that oaths are going to be tendered to college fellows pleading illness, and then skulks back into Cambridge again when the dust has settled. And that proves a remarkably successful tactic alongside a few friends in high places. And he survives in college through to 1651, so deep into the interregnum regime. Quite surprising that he lasts so long. Heads back to Suffolk with a few extended stays in London, so a period of internal exile, and then goes abroad, fed up with England and its Puritan government, and Oliver Cromwell, his mightiness, as he refers to him in the letters, in 1657, and does a kind of mini grand tour through the Dutch Republic, down the Rhine, into the Swiss Confederation, across to Venice, Padua, Rome, and ultimately comes back to England in a rather leisurely fashion after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, gets a lot of patronage from key figures in the restored Church of England. And what I think they see in him is a very bureaucratically able administrative fixer who can really get a grip on institutions and enforce various forms of conformity, raise a lot of money, all good things for college heads and so on today, of course. So in 1662, he becomes master of his old college, Emmanuel, with a brief to do a job on this former Puritan establishment, whip it into shape for the restored Church of England, which he does. He's then rewarded with 2 deaneries in quick succession, York, which he doesn't particularly like. He's not very good up north. It's a bit bleak from his point of view. He wants to be back closer to the sun, as he writes in his letters, further south. So he's quite pleased when he's made Dean of St. Paul's. Very big and important job. So St. Paul's, of course, the great cathedral of London, the heart of the realm, gives you considerable profile. Now, that was also a big job because St. Paul's was in such poor repair, despite being this great metropolitan centre. And even by 1664, it's had a series of travails. So this is a picture of old St. Paul's before the fire, actually a bigger building than the one that we have now, with this completely gigantic spire, which was destroyed by fire, I think after a lightning strike in 1561. You can see it without a spire a little bit later here in the Jacobean period. Sorry, it's a bit blurry when it's blown up large. But you can see from this that this is one of the great public spaces of early modern London. All the most prominent sermons preached in the period by the rising stars of the church get given here across the whole period. It's a very important public space. So being dean of this institution was always going to be a big job. But of course, in 1666, not that long after he's become dean, the whole place burns down rather annoyingly in September, confronting Sancroft with a mountain of work. So he becomes the kind of administrative fixer or fulcrum on which everything moves. And I don't want to become too great an advocate for the person I'm studying, which is always a risk in these kind of biographical studies. But it does seem to me that Wren, for lots of obvious reasons, Christopher Wren has got all the credit for this, the genius of the designs, but actually the administrative and financial labours that underpin the rebuilding of St. Paul's are overwhelmingly Sancroft's work. So as many of you probably know, there's a variety of different plans canvassed, some of them relatively eccentric. I rather wish this one had been built. I think it would have been splendid, magnificently strange. And of course, one of the problems that they're all wrestling with is how to create a Protestant cathedral from scratch. This is the first new built Protestant cathedral in England after the Reformation. Ultimately, the designs move towards rather more of what we know, and then what is ultimately built, this extraordinary, amazing design, which comes to dominate the cityscape of London very strongly. Of course, it's so heavily concealed by the hideous buildings that have been put up around it in the 20th century. But as this Canaletto painting of a Lord Mayor's show in the mid-18th century shows, back then, with much lower rise environment around it, it was utterly dominant on the London skyline. And this is very significantly William Sancroft's work. So doing all of that gives him a very high public profile and the connections which ensure that in 1677-8, he is appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, despite not having been a bishop before. So he's catapulted over the entire episcopate of the country and spends a very influential decade running the church. Perhaps most importantly, he's the last Archbishop of Canterbury to be running a very intolerant, monopolistic state church. The Toleration Act of 1689 will remove a lot of the legal foundations for that church. And by the 18th century, a lot of angry high Tory churchmen look back on the Sancroftian era in the 1680s as a kind of lost golden age of clerical Anglican privilege, when nonconformists were not allowed to run around without being thoroughly persecuted, as they thought that they deserved. Always be careful what you wish for in life. Sancroft becomes Archbishop and then has to face up in 1688 to the Glorious Revolution, to Dutch invasion, to the deprivation ultimately of James II and his replacement by William and Mary. Sancroft is a hopeless politician. This is not one of his strengths in life. He's a man of principle, unbending principle. And we all know what happens to principled people in political life. And he is duly caught up in these horrendous changes from his point of view, refuses to swear the new oaths of loyalty to William and Mary because he thinks his former oath to James is still in effect, and will be suspended and then deprived as Archbishop of Canterbury, ultimately skulking off back to his Suffolk family home, where he'll die in 1693, age 76. Which is pretty good considering how much his letters are littered with endless complaints about his health from a very early age. So we have this extraordinary rise and sudden and catastrophic decline in his career, very well documented in the letters. So that's what he did in terms of being a successful academic and clergyman. I'm already in danger of running over time, so I'll deal with imagery and representation particularly quickly. So just a couple of images of him from different points in his life. The one on the left, I think a very, very striking, very unusual 17th century portrait of Sancroft in his 30s, probably very early 1650s, portraying him in mourning for the death of the king in 1649 and his father, which he linked those two things together. The news of the regicide allegedly finished his father off. So we get this rather somber portrait. And then, best part of 40 years later, we see him as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1688, given an almost angelic slight haze there from a favourable portraitist, Luttrell. He's in the public consciousness, particularly in 1688, as a result of being put on trial by his own king. He's one of the 7 bishops who refuses to read James II's declaration of indulgence from Anglican pulpits. And when that refusal inexplicably finds its way into print, the king prosecutes 7 of his own bishops for seditious libel, a case which famously and spectacularly he loses. And we see a large number of prints with Sancroft in the middle there and the other 6 bishops, his other 6 diocesans around him. So briefly, rather heroic figures. We see them in a variety of print forms with these scriptural analogies and allusions built into the pictures. 7 stars, 7 churches of Asia. And they're even turned into exercises in calligraphy on the right there as well, these underlying prints and representations. Coins, medals, you name it, Sancroft's everywhere in 1688, mostly at that point in quite a favourable light. Very widely commented on in print, in literature as well, and there he divides authors very sharply. So just after his death, Sancroft's death, the young Jonathan Swift will write an ode to the memory of Sancroft, praising him to the heights as a great man of principle and a simple, patristic, apostolic kind of bishop, kind of person that Swift likes. Others less keen. Others describe him as a stingless old drone, morose and peevish, insolently proud, divides opinion very, very sharply. And that reflects the fact that he'd both defied his king in 1688 and refused to compromise with the regime that replaced that king in 1689, so he annoys just about everybody. So that's who he was in terms of what he did. That's who he was briefly, I know, in terms of representations. How does he understand himself? What's his self-fashioning? Well, Sancroft's letters certainly show a very introspective personality. He's very different to his politically aggressive predecessor as Archbishop, a man called Gilbert Sheldon. Sancroft informs his correspondents that he has a tranquil spirit and that his temper is prone to sluggishness, he writes. Shortly after his 40th birthday in 1657, he writes to a friend that his character was such that where I am, there I desire to be still, going so far as to claim that had I been otherwise, I might have made an excellent statue, unchanging, immovable. That's rather a weird self-image, imagining oneself to be a statue, but it's one that he cleaves to, this sense of stability, consistency, steadiness, not being moved by the way that the world changes around him. And it's certainly one that some of his contemporaries pick up on. He's regarded as a man of principle throughout his life, someone who will pick steadiness over popularity. So when Sancroft writes about other people being supple or nimble, these are not positive phrases in the Sancroft lexicon. So what kind of intellectual inspirations or mental resources does Sancroft have with which to make sense of his world and to shape his own identity within it? I think there are two most important sources. One is, predictably enough in this period, the apostolic and patristic past. So to a degree that might seem rather comical to us reading his letters, he does seem to superimpose a vision of the deserts of the Middle East and North Africa onto England's green and pleasant lands in his own present. So he's so deeply steeped in biblical scholarship and in patristic texts that his letters are absolutely stuffed full of talk of deserts and retreating into the wilderness and going out into the caves. And you almost imagine him sitting on top of a pillar out in the desert as some kind of hermit, which doesn't really mesh on to the reality of his life, but it's part of his self-image of primitive simplicity. Unfortunately, the world around him is changing very fast. 17th century England, a great era of revolution and change, of mutability, of destabilizing change, and from Sancroft's point of view, of the individuals who prosper within that world, putting worldly success over principle. I mentioned before, he's very classically well read, and I think Ovid's Metamorphoses come to provide Sancroft with a certain intellectual or emotional framing device, as well as showing a broader cast of mind that tends to express itself through inversions and rhetorical redescriptions. So when he's writing to Richard Holdsworth, the deprived master of the college I mentioned earlier, he tells him that you become brighter in your obscurity, freer and more enlarged in a prison. And those kind of descriptions he comes to apply increasingly to himself, not least during the final exile, internal exile, back in Suffolk, after being deprived as Archbishop. At that point, he says that I'm old enough to look back 40 years, so back onto the 1640s and 50s, that Puritan revolutionary era. Look back 40 years, and by comparing times and events to find that all is but vitas fabula per novus histriones, that's to say the old story with new players. So things are running over and over again. Now, he's understandably bitter about these changes and reaches for Ovid, for the Metamorphoses, to provide a series of descriptions to latch on to. So again, writing to Richard Holdsworth in 1644, Sancroft complains in his letters that these new phaetons began to usurp upon us. That's to say, the intruded Puritans in Cambridge. So Phaethon, of course, was the child of the sun god, Helios or Phoebus, who tricked his father into allowing him to drive the sun chariot for a day. That proves too much for him. It's too difficult, too demanding. The horses go out of control, and Zeus has to kill Phaethon with a thunderbolt to stop the careering chariot destroying the whole earth. And this becomes quite a trope of Renaissance art. You see Rubens having a go. So Phaethon falling out of the chariot, having been struck by the thunderbolt to save the earth. Rather more crudely, ceramic plate, the 1530s, or fresco in a Genoese palace. It's a very well-known set of imagery, wonderful, affecting story. Now, Phaethon's father, Phoebus, had tried to warn him this wasn't a good idea, what he wanted to do, and tried to teach him his own tactics for keeping the sun chariot on track. And in Ovid's words, he has Phoebus say, "The rushing sky is constantly turning and drags along the remote stars and whirls them in rapid orbits. I move the opposite way, and its momentum does not overcome me as it does all other things, and I ride contrary to its swift rotation." Contrary to its swift rotation. And the key Latin phrase that there evokes this sense of riding contrary to something in order to keep a sure and predictable path is Rapido Contrarius orbi. Rapido Contrarius orbi. And that kind of reactionary credo becomes something of a personal motto for Sancroft. Those Latin words appear on several of his portraits. They're frequently mentioned in his correspondence. And they even survive today on that rather dud statue on the left there, which is part of Sancroft's surviving library in Emmanuel College, Cambridge. You can see at the bottom there, Rapido Contrarius orbi. This is his own motto that develops. So it chimes then with a broader self-image, a man of inflexible principle who would never simply follow where a crowd led, and indeed if he saw a crowd going one way, would tend to go the other himself. Magnificent conservative credo. So to conclude, letters are really very important and significant in Sancroft's own life and career, and interesting, at least for me, to work on as a modern scholar. The letters allowed him to build and maintain friendships, something I haven't had the time to talk about today, and to pursue patronage and favour with his superiors, and ultimately also to direct the church when he's archbishop. He really can put a bit of stick about in his letters, make people jump when he's archbishop. Also, the letters help us to understand how he understood himself, how he took himself to be born to be a clergyman in God's church and understood worldly affairs in terms of God's inscrutable providence. He was a conservative who prided himself on consistency and on fixed principles. Ultimately, being a conservative in this very volatile 17th century is a pretty tough beat. And as a connoisseur of spiritual suffering, I think Sancroft, one could say, becomes one of the great beneficiaries of the revolutionary 17th century, because ultimately he gets the miserable outcome that a part of him had always craved.